An Edible Earth by Julia Waddles. Amy is doing a science project about the layers of the Earth. She wants to make a cake to represent the Earth. There are 4 layers to the Earth. The first layer is the crust. The crust is very rocky and brittle, and it fractures when there are earthquakes. The second layer is the mantle. The mantle is the thickest, and it makes up 63.7% of the Earth's mass. The third layer is the outer core. This is liquid and very hot. The last layer is the inner core. It is solid and made up of iron, nickel, and cobalt. Now that we know about Amy's project, we can get into detail. The first layer, or outer part of the cake, could be brown to represent the crust. But what embellishments could we put on the cake to make people know that it's the crust? This is what we already know about the crust. It is very rocky and brittle, and it fractures during earthquakes. But what do we not know about the crust? Well, there are 2 types, oceanic and continental. Let's learn more about these 2. Let's start with oceanic. Oceanic crust is made out of rocks, basalt, and gabbro. It is also made out of mafic magma from the sea floor. Oceanic crust is also denser than continental crust. So we've learned about oceanic crust, but what about continental crust? Let's learn more. The second type of crust is continental crust. Continental crust is composed of various rock, kind of like granite. It is much less dense than oceanic crust, and it is much thicker than oceanic crust. So let's go back to what we know about the crust. Now we must decide what ingredient or embellishment should we put on the cake to make it look like crust. Since the crust is rocky and brittle, we should focus on something that's rocky and brittle. But what should we use? Ooh, I know, peanut brittle. And yes, I said peanut brittle. So now we know what to do for the crust. Let's look at the mantle. Let's use red to represent the mantle, since it is the thickest part. What should we use to embellish the mantle? We already know that the mantle makes up 63.7% of the Earth's mass, and it's made of magma and molten rock. What we're learning is how heat flows using convection and conduction within the mantle. Conduction is when heat is transferred through fast collisions of atoms. Convection is when the bottom of the mantle is heated and the particles move quickly, causing it to rise. So how do we incorporate what we already know and what we're learning into a cake? What should we use for the mantle? We know that we're using red to represent the mantle, and the mantle is really hot. But how would we represent heat? It's not like we're going to put anything spicy in a cake, but we could use peppermint. Now let's move on to the last layers, the outer core and the inner core. What do we know already? Well, we know that the outer core is liquid, and it makes up 30.8% of the Earth's mass. It is also entirely molten. We know that the inner core is solid, and it's made of metals iron, nickel, and cobalt. Without the inner core, the Earth would not have a magnetic field. The magnetic field is caused by convection currents in the outer core. The inner core and the outer core are both hot and less dense than the rest of the Earth. The outer core is liquid and the inner core is solid. But what could we use to represent those? Chocolate. And yes, I said chocolate, because everybody loves chocolate. Recap our ingredients. We're using peanut brittle for the crust, peppermint for the mantle, and chocolate for both the outer core and the inner core. Overall, we've learned that the Earth would make a very interesting dessert.